The Dalai Lama once said that today, more than ever before, life must be characterized by a sense of universal responsibility, not only nation to nation and human to human, but also human to other forms of life. Join me in conversation with some of the world's most creative thinkers to explore the importance of ethics to this responsible decision-making in today's technologically infused world. Artists, entrepreneurs, scientists, journalists, academics, and beyond navigate the gray, the blend of right and wrong, of opportunities and risks on all sides of our most important challenges, whether gene editing, civilian space travel, or artificial intelligence. They also probe the age-old and more ethically black and white behaviors, such as sexual misconduct, human trafficking, and life-threatening inequality. Our guests endeavor to transcend religious, political, national, and ethnic perspectives, but recognize the inevitable biases we all bring. The term ethics can make us uncomfortable. At the Ethics Incubator, we confront the E word head-on. It may be inconvenient or even unclear, but ethical conundrums underpin almost every headline and affect almost every human choice. With truth under threat and the boundaries of humanity blurring, I believe that ethical decision-making tethers us to our humanity. As always, we welcome your thoughts. Warm welcome, and thank you so much for doing this. It's hard to know where to start when you're just coming out of your fourth Olympic medal, third gold in Paris, you and your teammates. We're going to get to that. For now, warmest congratulations, very enthusiastic congratulations for Team USA and you and your colleagues. But if I may, I'd like to ground the discussion a little bit by starting in sort of earliest and youngest years.
Yeah.
And in particular, open up the discussion. Tell us a little bit about that. What was greatest markers for you? But I've also heard you say that where we start does not necessarily determine our path.
Absolutely.
And I'd love you to comment a little bit on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to thank you for having me. I think that being able to get my story and have a voice to be able to expand, not only just as an athlete, but as a dad, is something that will have and will last way after my time is over. So I appreciate this opportunity. But yeah, so my story starts back in Maryland at birth. I was born with a birth defect called congenital focal and I tell people it's this big fancy word for basically I was born with no limbs. And to be honest, my journey, I would say, started with my mom, right? Because I was her fourth of five kids and the only one to have a disability. So her having to be able to navigate having five total children, one needing special attention. And if you can imagine pulling the legs off of a Barbie doll, and that's what my disability looks like. So you try to put a diaper on that as you're just having blowouts left and right, right? Mm-hmm. So her ability to pivot is where I'm like, that's where I got to see resilience and overcoming obstacles at such a young age. And it's something that I saw throughout my youth.
And at what point did you start even thinking about sports? Because you've played a lot of sports before you got to basketball. So can you tell us a little bit about your sporting journey and how did that come to be? And is that part of how you were defining yourself and beginning to think about, so what is your true north? Where do you find sort of your guiding principles, your true north?
When I was younger, my brothers and sisters didn't take anything light on me just because I had a disability, right? And so you're always competing in a household with five kids. And so wanting to be the best started at a young age. I wanted to beat my brothers in everything they did. It wasn't until my stepdad, who I call my dad, came into my life that he actually introduced me to sport, where I was able to actually showcase my specialties and my respective sport, just like my brothers, because they were in football and basketball and they played their sports. And I didn't really have a league until my dad introduced me into those things. So when I was able to like embrace wheelchair track, which was actually my first passion, it wasn't even basketball. Basketball was used as like a cross trainer. it gave me the opportunity to be in the discussion of alpha athlete of the household.
What courage, right? To be able to say, hey, I'm going to compete with all of them. And I'm not, irrespective of our differences, very, very, very different situations.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing of that though is that like it's natural. As a human being, I feel like it's innate in us to want to be great, want to be the best at what we do, especially when we have love for what it is. So you take the bond of siblings, and I have, great siblings that they want the best for you and you want to bring the best out of them. And if that means that you're having to up your sibling every single time, like I don't think it has to do with like what you have as a quote unquote able body or a disabled individual. I think it's just human nature to want to be the best at everything you do.
So, as part of being the best, I mean, one of the things that we're seeing out in the world today, and certainly in a lot of the ethics work, is the best might be the most profitable. The best might be, the quirkiest technology or, the move fast and break things. How did you start to define yourself as the best in terms of what kinds of principles or ethical guidelines or true north or however you want to describe it?
I'm an introvert, like in actuality. People say that like I'm an introvert with extrovert tendencies. I'm able to be able to speak with you today, and I'm able to speak with kids at assemblies. But like, if you actually look at my personality, I'm very introverted. I'm very humble when it comes to recognizing greatness around me. I understand that people can look at me and they see greatness when it comes to the medals, and I'm happy that they're able to see that, but I also want them to understand that there's stuff in the background that you're not seeing. The true people that continue to push me every single day to be the best version of myself. And I'm a firm believer that if it's not for those people that are behind me that you don't see, my family, my friends, my kids, they're the reason that I'm able to be here in front of you, be in front of the world, showcasing what we did to accomplish greatness.
So I love the way you put that because I've always believed that ethics is a team sport. And when ethics breaks down, it's also a team sport. It
Yes.
becomes, in many ways, it becomes, first of all, a very contagious phenomenon. So you have lots of participants in it, and you also have lots of people holding it up, whether it's by keeping secrets or, other sorts of participation. But talk a little bit about how there are two teams I'm really interested in. One is it's become very clear that you are a dedicated family man.
Yeah.
And so you must be thinking about how all of this is part of being a father, part of raising children. So how do you think about true north, ethics as a team sport with your children? I mean, I realize that they're still young, but also how does that work in Team USA?
Each of those pieces that you just talked about are a part of my identity, right?
Mhm.
Along with my disability. We're made up and we use and wear a bunch of different hats throughout our lifetime. And for me, it's the things that motivate me to be great, to be the best for them, or to be the best for my teammates. I think that when it comes to my kids, I remember what it's like knowing that like your dad left at a young age, your biological dad, I should say,
Mhm.
left at such a young age. But a man that had no biological connection to you at all came in and assumed the responsibilities of a father. Didn't care that we didn't have any chromosomes in common at all, but it didn't change the love that he has for me or his grandchildren. And I think that's what it makes me want to be a better person for them. Like love doesn't know any,
Mhm.
DNA. And
Right.
and and that's what I'm like, okay, so when I go to teach my kids about love, we love our friends become our family. And although there's no blood relation there, the bonds are strong there.
But what you
And
also just described, Trey, is love is an action verb.
yeah,
Right? It shows
absolutely.
up. It's the way I describe ethics. It's decision by decision. I always say to my students at Stanford, we're only as ethical as our last decision.
Hmm.
And this man who you call dad has apparently shown up for you decision by decision by decision, just keeps showing up. That's that action. It's love as an action verb, and it sounds
And
like that's what you're modeling for your children as well.
yeah, and what's crazy? What you're like, I agree with the concept and notion that you're talking about, right? With the decisions, and the ethics that follow suit of that. One of the things that we also try to get across to our kids that my dad kind of got across to me is that the decisions that we make, no matter what that decision is, good, bad, or indifferent, right? We can't change what it is, but that moment also doesn't define who we are as an individual. I can make a bad choice, a bad decision, but it doesn't
Exactly.
make me a bad person. And I think that's the thing that like I'm trying to get not only my kids, but when I go into schools and we have these situations and we're having these presentations, that yeah, sometimes we make bad choices, but that doesn't make us a bad person.
No, absolutely. And that's so important, by the way, not only in the ethics of young people, you talk about going into schools, but with the mental health. This epidemic of mental health issues, in particular among young people, this sense that, once a bad decision has been made, however one describes bad, that people are sort of tarred and feathered for life. And by
Yeah.
the way, the reverse can't be true either. It can't be that you do one good thing and you sort of have a life pass, right?
Yes.
It
Yes.
doesn't kind of it
Yes.
doesn't kind of work that way. There's so much I want to get to, including the Secret Service, but let's go back to let's talk a little bit about Paralympics.
Yeah.
I've heard you describe persons living with disabilities as the largest minority group,
Yes.
and talk a little bit more about that and what that means for what we should be doing, how we should be showing up as a society.
To answer the first part of that question, what people don't really realize is that like they look at disabilities and they think that it fits into one tree. Let's just say that, right? It's one cookie cutter thing. This is what disabilities are. In actuality, it grows in multiple directions. Kind of like an iceberg, right? You see the stuff on top, and then you got a lot of stuff underneath down below. And what tends to happen is we put everyone in here for disabilities, and they're like, "Oh, Trey, you know something about like this disabled person who's blind." Well, I can only tell and speak on what my truth is because this is the disability that I know.
Mhm.
But disability doesn't discriminate on race, gender, sexual orientation, religion. It spans across everything. And one of the craziest things when we look at demographics is that at any point in time, someone can become a part of the disabled community. And eventually, we're all going to become a part of it if you look at it from an age standpoint, right?
Mhm.
We're going to be able at some point in time in our life not to be able to do something that we used to be able to do at a high rate, especially when we were younger. Then we start to fall into that category. So there is no discrimination upon that. For me to be able to see the Paralympics grow and change this stigma when you think about individuals with disabilities. I remember when I was fresh in college, like when I would ask kids, like, when you envision someone with a disability, what does that look like? What does their life look like?
Mhm.
And it's always on a drastic scale. What the Paralympics has done, it's shown the world that there is life beyond your disability, showing that people are out here giving their time and effort to master their sport, their speciality. And I think that that's what we're starting to see because in 2012, my first Paralympic Games, it was like you had to have some special web link or in a password to see and access these games. Whereas now you can click on the TV and you're seeing live game coverage.
Right.
So
Well,
like
Paris, just before we go any further, let's just have a review of your many medals.
oh, yeah. So I've been fortunate enough to be on a lot of successful teams. So my first medal came in 2012, in London, where we won bronze, and then we three-peated gold in Rio in 2016, Tokyo, I call it 2021 because of
Right.
COVID, and then Paris in 2024.
Is there something that you think accounts for this consistent, extraordinary performance?
Absolutely. I think I kind of touched on it earlier. I think it's the people that I have around me and the teams that we had. I think you saw a progression on how the teams had come together. The reason that I continue to come back and I continue to play and train is because of the guys that I play with. I owe it to them. There's a sense of responsibility and accountability. One of the things that people don't know is that we're scattered across the entire United States.
Right.
We come to a tryout and then we come to different training camps throughout the year, maybe 4 or 5, and then we have to collectively come together come tournament time. But in between those times, I'm at home. I owe it to my team to be here, giving it my full effort to make sure that I'm prepared for when game time comes. Not only to my team, but for the family that supported me. So while my wife is here with the kids and I'm out training, I owe it to her to be given 100% because dad's not home to help. So
Right.
my
But you're also not together like a college sports team or like, the
right,
NBA or that are all sort of packing around together and living in the same city.
yeah,
Um, so this platform, the Ethics Incubator and other podcasts I might do, always bring together people from very diverse backgrounds. So people who run museums, who run global NGOs like Doctors Without Borders, and in fact, the executive director of WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency,
yeah.
I interviewed. And I'd like to just touch on, what do you see as the most important ethical challenges for sports today? And are they different when it comes to Paralympics?
The most challenging thing is the pressure that athletes that are put on athletes.
Mhm.
And the reason that I keep it so vague is because the pressures are vague. You can have athletes like kids. Kids are athletes. If they're playing sports, they're athletes. The pressure that parents are putting on kids at such a young age, right? Or the
Absolutely.
or the pressures that when you get to a professional or an amateur athlete, the pressures of being able to put success on the table, right? When you play for like Team USA, it's like sometimes athletes feel like it's gold or bust,
Hmm.
right? And being able to change that narrative because then people start to, like you said, you interviewed someone from WADA, right?
Right.
Then athletes start to do other things that aren't ethically sound in order to obtain these different things. You throw social media in on that, then like I said, there's pressures coming from all sorts of directions, and they're coming at different
So what you just
stages.
described is something that I would describe in even broader terms, and it's very interesting to hear you talk about in athletics, and that is an epidemic of perfectionism. And I
Absolutely,
always believe that with perfectionism, from an ethics standpoint, it's one of the most dangerous things because there are only three ways people can respond to perfectionist standards. And as you say, there are different ways to describe it, pressure, etc., sales targets that are unrealistic, however you describe it, right? But one way is to give up because why try when you know that perfection is not an achievable goal? The second,
absolutely,
possible response is to cheat to try to achieve it. Because if you can't achieve it normally, so to speak, you need some extra support, whether that's stealing or whether that's drugs. And interestingly, you talk about kids, and I know that WADA is very focused on kids now. But I remember years ago when there was the Lance Armstrong story, I was walking down the streets of Palo Alto, and one of my friends had a 12-year-old, just I would call it an average 12-year-old athlete, nobody with particular ambitions, but a decent athlete. And I remember he said to me, Susan, what's the big deal with doping? Everybody's doing it. And in his world, everybody's doing it meant all the 12-year-olds are doing it,
yeah,
right? Not all the Lance Armstrongs of the world are doing it. And then the third, of course, is just to be banging one's head against a wall, so to speak, in order to try to achieve perfectionism. And that's where we get back to the mental health epidemic. So
absolutely,
by definition, you're all under so much pressure. But when we look at scoring in a whole bunch of different sports, it can be so close, it can be a point or two. And that doesn't redefine an athlete as a lower caliber athlete, at least for those of us
exactly.
who are not athletes.
And what's crazy about this is that, and you kind of touched on it earlier, that it's not just athletes that see these pressures. I
Mhm.
mean, what about the pressures of a student, a scholar looking to get into that university,
Mhm.
or that lawyer that is being drilled down with all the case papers that they have? You know,
Right.
though, like it spans more than it's just any competitive field. So that can be corporate, that can be athletics, it can be anything that has some feel of competition to it.
Right. And then you mentioned, I thought that was so astute of you, but you mentioned it's all turbocharged by social media or any form of seeking celebrity.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
social media has become, even if you're not a Trey or you're not a member of Team USA or some other equivalent in some other domain, everybody wants to be out there showing their quote unquote best self. Usually they're unrealistic or at least incomplete best self, right?
Yes.
That's another driver of the unethical behavior. What about technology? Has technology at all changed the ethics of your sport?
I don't know if it would I would say would change the ethics of the sport because I feel like it has given us the grounds to get better, if that makes sense. If you think about it, the technologies and the equipment that we use has progressed, changing the way that we're able to design chairs, personalize it for ourselves, or implementing them into training exercises. So I think that that helps us gives us an edge in order to be the best version of ourselves when we're in the competitive environment. Uh, I think that there is a lack of resources when you look at it from different programs,
Mhm.
is where you'll see the disparity at. But I think that's just based on what kind of resources are available to those athletes.
So when you speak about resources, would this be something that, when the trays of the world design something, if you had the resources to have it trickle down so that a 14-year-old could have that,
Yeah.
would that make a big difference in all aspects, not just sort of athletic success, but in all aspects of their experience of development?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, if you think about it, even from a resource standpoint, when we play countries that don't have as much funding as we have, like I'll
Mhm.
give you an example. When we had played against Africa in 2009, one of the U23 teams, they were showing up in chairs that were falling apart while we were playing in those games because they don't
Oh,
have those
right.
resources like we have. We had extra parts for our chairs, tubings, and tires. So that's why, like, there's a disparity in where the finances are actually going. I mean, if you look at those resources, you can look at that in a demographic of geography in the
Mhm.
United States as well, right? You go to
Absolutely.
more of an urban area that doesn't have, the resources to be able to give the education that might be needed for those kids. You're going to see difference in test scores, right?
Mhm.
So like it's no different in that standpoint. But I think that's why it takes like athletes like myself, athletes like Steve and Matt, who we're working on a project now that hopefully we'll be able to bring those technologies and those equipments to those underserved communities to try to even the playing field, give them an opportunity to have things that they might not have had before.
So before we get on to another topic, and I think next up maybe the Secret Service, tell me what was your most challenging moment in Paralympic basketball and what was your greatest moment?
I'll tell you the greatest moment first. The greatest moment was this recent gold medal game that we won in Paris. And it wasn't just for the fact that we were able to accomplish something that no one's ever done in history, being the first men's team to three-peat gold. It was the fact that this was the first time that I actually had my family there to celebrate it with me at a
Oh,
Paralympic Games.
wonderful.
Yeah, so my two beautiful children and my wife Laura were actually able to be on that court with us after the game because again, when people look at us, they don't see the people that sacrifice time away from home.
Mhm.
It's them. So to be able to celebrate that with them was phenomenal. I think the biggest challenge in the pursuit of being a Paralympic athlete is is finding the the mental fortitude to make it through tough times.
Mhm.
And for me, I think that COVID was hard for all of us, right? But trying to deal with COVID and the notion of Paralympic Games are coming,
Right.
and they're talking about postponement and cancellation of these games. I've been building up to make sure that I can peak come, what is it, September at that point in
Mhm.
2020. Now you have to wrap your head around like this is might not happen. So those 3 years of preparation are gone and out the window.
I felt so terrible for for athletes in many different circumstances, and for others who were going to have their one shot at something, whether it was a performance on, in a dramatic setting or otherwise. I felt just terrible. There was so many people who had that prepared, sacrifice, 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 and then the moment couldn't happen.
Yeah,
Uh,
we only get there are certain things that we only get one of, right?
right,
Like the kids that didn't get graduation
right,
from high school, like that's a milestone that everyone's excited about, and you had to do it virtually.
yeah.
Or like that opportunity to play your last senior game, or like there's just several ones that you can't get back once they're gone. And it's heartbreaking to know that they won't be able to experience that same thing that some of us had experienced before.
Let me switch gears if I may. You
Yeah.
also lead a life of service through the Secret Service. Can you tell us a little bit about what your role is at the Secret Service and how did you come to a career in the Secret Service, given
Yeah.
all of the focus on basketball? And then I guess, how do you do it all?
Yeah, so like one of the biggest misconceptions that people don't understand is that Paralympic and Olympic athletes are like we got all the TV deals, which brings in a lot of money, and we're set for life. In actuality, a lot of us have to still work full-time jobs while we're competing. For me, I've always been vested in like criminal justice. Like that's what my background is in my master's and my bachelor's. So when I was afforded the opportunity to interview with the Secret Service at a career fair, I dropped off my application to the or my resume to all the other organizations. But when I saw the Secret Service, I spent more time with them. So a couple months later, I get an interview, and I'm like, yeah, I am interested. Let's make this happen. Yeah, it took off. And in actuality, it happened in the midst of COVID too, right? So like that was
Wow, yeah.
something that kept my mind off of the Paralympics a little bit. So I'm a personnel security specialist, and what we do is we clear people to come work for us in any capacity. So that's a part of I'm a part of the security team that does that. It's it's an honor to work for them because they've supported me really well in this journey. But like like I said before, it's a team effort to get here. And they gave me an awesome send off to Paris, and
Mhm.
they had a watch party while I was in Paris. So like the support has been phenomenal.
But it also is an incredible opportunity to learn what a career to have, and what service. And what about, I'm not sure if you can talk about this, but what about the ethical issues there? What do you think are the greatest ethical issues with the security of senior people in our country, the people that the Secret Service really specialize
Yes.
in?
So I won't be able to talk about that, especially without having some sort of clearance
Mhm.
with our comms department. But I will say that one of the ethical issues that I am like very firm on is that like the what we talked about a little bit earlier is that the disabled community makes up the largest minority demographic in the United States and throughout the world. But we also represent here in the United States the largest population of individuals that are unemployed. And
Oh,
I just recently learned that we also make up the largest demographic of those individuals to have post secondary education and still be unemployed. So when you hear that and you want to make sure that these qualified individuals find qualified positions wherever that may be, is kind of heartbreaking. So that when we have these conversations, I want to see people that look like me be in positions like myself or be in executive positions that are able to lead organizations and companies to curb that staggering number of people that are unemployed.
that's a
Um,
heartbreaking statistic because they're like every other sort of discrimination. There's absolutely no relationship in, I'm imagining 99.9% of the cases between the disability and the ability to do the role that is required.
Absolutely. And but I think that it takes individuals like myself to show individuals that like there is no drop off. And I think that's the biggest thing that we're seeing. We're afraid that there may be a drop off. And since we're testing the waters of unknown, we would rather swim in the waters of what we do know
Mhm.
rather than venture out and be vulnerable and swim in waters that we don't. And what I'll say also to that is that like for me, I also wanted to tailor my resume. I remember several years ago tailoring my resume to make sure it had no relation to having saying that I had a disability because I was fearful that that would be taken against me in this process. Or when we get those, those surveys where you can fill out your demographics, where you're like, okay, this is my race,
Right.
this is my gender. Oh, do you have a disability? And I remember going through those and being like, I prefer not to answer. I prefer not to answer. I prefer not to answer because I'm so fearful that I might get dinged for one of these things when I feel like I'm qualified for the position that's in front of me.
That's really interesting. And I think right now, the way data is being managed, I don't think there's a lot of confidence in those kinds of surveys or those kinds of questionnaires that
Yeah,
are, purportedly anonymized, but de-anonymization or reversing the anonymity has become pretty
very
hard.
easy.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
So broadening the lens a little bit, we're at a very difficult time in the history of the world in a lot of different ways. I mean,
absolutely.
one challenge is AI, and there's vast opportunity, but there's also vast risk. But the world geopolitically is chaos. And I'm just looking, when you read the newspaper headlines, what is of the greatest interest to you in terms of stories that are ethics laden?
The things that impact my kiddos, and the things that like hit my heart. It's really tough to read, and it was just recently, like the shootings of the kids and Madison. When you read stuff like that, like it's an automatic fear of what environment our kids are being raised in, and God Godspeed that like you get a phone call like that. Like that's where like my mind races to, and making sure that my kiddos have, because ultimately we want to leave the world to be a better place for them to grow for generations and the next generation. That's all we all want for anyone. I don't care where you fall on the spectrum. You just want it to be better for the next generation to have. The difference is we all are getting there from a different viewpoint and by a different means. And so that's where that battle of efficacy comes in, because while I think one person's truth can be someone's else opposition, and I think that's where things start to clash.
So that's an interesting point because we are getting into a world where truth is under threat
Okay.
and where facts are no longer an accepted phenomenon, and where fact and opinion, in my view, both very important things, but not the same thing,
Yeah.
are getting confused and conflated. So all of that is terrifying. And the school shootings in the US, it's an utterly horrifying phenomenon. And if we don't get a handle on that as a civilized society, it's just absolutely horrifying. You mentioned that we all have in common sort of wanting to leave the world a better place, wanting to create something better for our children, for the next generation. One of the other things I've seen over the years that we all have in common is that people want to be seen for who they really are. And I'm wondering, in your experience, what can we all do to be better at seeing people we're with for who they really are? With all of the flaws and inconsistencies, and nobody's perfect, but how important is it that we see people for who they really are to you? And again, what is it that we can each do better to make people feel seen?
The biggest thing is being open to something that's different than you. And for me, this is something that I've had to deal with my entire life, right? I'm different than you. If I stand next to you, or I stand next to my brother, I stand next to a random stranger, there's a gross difference between the people that you see. So it's automatically different. But now it's, what kind of conversation are we going to have? One of the biggest talks that when I talk to people is that the unconscious biases that we put in kids' minds. So I'll give an example. If I'm out and about in the community, right, and come across a kid, the kid looks at me, he points at me, and he goes, "Mommy, what's wrong with him?" Subconsciously, what we're doing is we're taking this kid and we're trying to remove him from the situation, like, shh, no, we don't say that, and pull them away from the situation. Well,
Mhm.
subconsciously, you're teaching this kid that the interaction shouldn't happen. We need to remove ourselves from this, instead of being like, okay, maybe that's not the proper way to approach the conversation. Because now I think that that kid, when he sees an individual with a disability, it's like, oh no, let's turn around and go the other way instead of engaging in meaningful conversation between the two. Yes, this is different, but there's some sort of commonality here. I think the biggest thing for me is when I talk to people and we have conversations and I do speeches, I think that the way you get through to someone's heart with a message is a connection that you have with that individual, finding some sort of common ground where you're like, okay, we can speak. We might not agree
Mhm.
on what's being said. It might be different, but being able to understand that there's some sort of connection that we can have and understanding where that person is and where they're coming from.
So in what you say, it really strikes me. There are a couple of questions that I like to ask people when I meet someone in, for example, in a hospital in difficult circumstances, or whether it's very close friends, or whether it's students, or whether it's children who are much younger than my Stanford students, or client or advising clients. There are two questions that I really like. One is, can you tell me more? And the other is, what's it like to be you?
Yeah, that last one, I love that last one.
And I think it's really, really important. And it doesn't matter whether, it can be that somebody's going through an experience, some sort of loss or trauma. And rather than saying, oh, I know what it's like when somebody's family falls apart, or I know what it's like when someone's grandfather passes away, to really ask, what's it like for you? What's it like for you now? And then maybe come back to the question later on, those two things. But I also love what you said about common ground is great, but we should be able to have conversations even when we don't have common ground. And we shouldn't end up at this, highly polarized, highly aggressive, attack first kind of society. I also really, in terms of young people, I'm always conscious of the fact that we had gone through as a society this kind of culture of calling people out, canceling.
Yeah.
So I have a policy in my classes that is we cancel bad ideas. We don't cancel people. And I think that's really important because we got to a point, especially a couple of years ago, with this so-called cancel culture. There were versions of that about canceling people. And that, completely undermines what you said at the beginning of our discussion, which is that people can have bad decisions or even many bad decisions or bad years. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they deserve to be canceled as a person.
What's crazy is like as you're speaking about this, I'm also thinking because I love having deep thought and I love playing devil's advocate when I have these conversations with my friends, is that when you look at a decision or something that happens and we're like, okay, that's a bad choice or a bad decision, and we look at that from a particular lens is why it is bad, right? But are we able to see from a different lens where that could actually be a good decision from a
Right.
different lens, right? And I think that that's the difference. Sometimes, like, I think we're so fixated on our ideologies that we're unable to see what this aspect looks like from a different lens. Playing devil's advocate doesn't mean that you're one way or another, but it gives you a perspective on something that you might not have thought about. And I love having these conversations and debates with dear friends of mine because we could talk about hours about different things, but trying to understand the other side is remarkable.
I think one of the things you're getting at, another way to phrase devil's advocate is perspective.
Yeah.
Trying on the world from somebody else's shoes. And there's a lot of ways to do that. I always talk about, reading a novel is a phenomenal way to try on somebody else's life, right? Having the kind of discussions that you're having, watching a film, just observing somebody in the grocery store and sort of wondering, what it is like, what's it like to be them? But all of this is, clearly this idea of thoughtfulness, this idea of resilience, this commitment to fighting perfectionism, or at least toxic perfectionism, which doesn't mean fighting high standards. You clearly have very, very gold medal winning, you know, standards in every aspect of your life as a family, as a dedicated family man first, with the Secret Service and also obviously with your sport. Just a couple more questions, if I may, and you've been so
Yeah.
generous with your time. What is the ethical decision that you've made that you're the most proud of?
I think the recognition of where the next generation is going to go and how I could get it there, understanding that there is no benefit for me. So I think the biggest thing is like, okay, when I'm gone, where do I see my sports? Where do I see our family's legacy? And where do I see the education from the people where I grew up can change to be? And I think the biggest notion is that like wanting fame, there's nothing wrong with that. Being remembered, again, nothing wrong with that. But can you have an impact on a community? Can you have an impact on the next generation that's felt two, three, four generations after you've accomplished or did what you've done? One of the biggest things that I tell people is that you could take the medals and the accolades away. What do you have in front of you now? I don't want people just to have the conversation with me because I'm a four-time Paralympic medalist.
Mhm.
I want them to have a conversation with me because of the individual that I am and the message that I leave.
Mhm.
Because the message that you leave is something that will be left long term.
So I love what you're saying, because what you're saying is, in addition to your legacy as an athlete and your legacy as a father and your legacy as a professional, you are consciously crafting a legacy of ethics.
Yeah.
You are put differently, to come back to the earlier part of our conversation, you are consciously crafting a way to influence the way subsequent generations make decisions.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think it starts here. Like it's crazy for me to think that for me to be my best for my family, for my team, for the people that I work with, that I don't start with this individual. I can't correct something else if I'm not right.
Right.
And that's where it starts.
Just a couple more questions, if I may. Is there somebody, and it doesn't have to be in sport, but is there somebody who is just an icon for you, somebody who you really, really admire and look up to? Who would that person be?
One of the biggest things is when people ask me, I'm coached by committee, right? There's several little things that I'm pulling from several different pieces. I've had five, six influential coaches on my life that have changed the way that I view sport. But I also have the friends and the people that back me. But if you're asking me to pick one person, and I had to pick one person, it would be my dad. You have a man that has no connection to our family of five or six, counting my mom, right? And he comes in and he's able to give a sense of fatherhood to a fatherless person, changes the way you look at everything.
So he is doing exactly what you said you're setting out to do. He is really driving the next generation and more, and grandchildren, as you said, and that will be passed down. What have
Exactly.
I not asked you that I should have? Whether fun fact
Fun
or
fact.
deep ethical reflection.
Oh, well, fun fact, I'm a crafter I'm not good at it, but I love to do it because it's something that we can do as a family and it's something that connects us. Whenever people come to our house, we have a paint night and we have a wall with all the paintings from the people that have ever come just to show that like we can leave our mark no matter where we are. So that's
Oh,
something near and dear
wonderful.
to me. And again, it's not about the look of something being perfect, like a painting when we look at it, because as we know, painting is subjective, right?
Mhm.
The art looks different for you than it does to me. But understanding that those people that have come here and they visited, their mark is being left. So I guess that crafting also has a deep kind of meaning for it for all of us here in my family.
But I also love that, because if you have lots of different paintings, it's a bit like a chorus. There's an amazing beauty in a mosaic of imperfect pieces of art, just like the best choruses are not 100% the best voices.
Yes.
It's sort of a musical mosaic of a combination of a lot of voices that together make a statement, that together create a sound. I love that.
Yes, absolutely.
Is there anything else you'd like to comment on, or any one thing you'd like listeners to take away?
The one thing I always do, even when I sign my autograph on my pictures, is be the best version of yourself. I think so many times like we talked about earlier, in the chase of perfectionism, we start to lose who we are. And the only person that can define who that is ourselves. When we look in the mirror, what do you see? What do you want to see? And obviously there are influences out there in the world, family, ads, whatever you call it, ideologies. But at the end of the day, if you're happy with the person that you see, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks because you're the best version of you.
I think if we all did that, the world would be a much better place. Trey, it's such an honor and a pleasure to end 2024 with this discussion with you. Thank you so much. It's really so generous of you to spend so much time.
I appreciate the time here today. This is meaningful conversation that needs to happen more often.
Thank you so much.